The evening air was crisp and cold, wrapping the city in a quiet chill. Streetlights flickered, casting a warm golden glow on the sidewalks. The hum of New York City never stopped. Cars honking, people laughing, footsteps clicking against the pavement. Among the crowd, Olivia Carter walked with steady steps, her long coat billowing slightly as she moved. She had spent the last few months fighting a tough legal battle. It was one of the biggest cases of her career, one that could change lives. And today, she had won. The courtroom had been tense, but when the final verdict was read, she had felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Justice had been served, and that was all that mattered. To celebrate, she decided to treat herself to dinner at Golden Oaks, an upscale restaurant known for its fine dining and elegant ambience. She had heard people talk about it, how the soft candlelight made every table glow, how the food melted in your mouth, and how the service was nothing less than perfect. As she neared the entrance, a warm breeze slipped through the door as a waiter stepped out to welcome a couple. Olivia hesitated for a moment, adjusting the strap of her purse. She was not one to seek luxury, but tonight was special. Tonight, she wanted to sit back, relax, and enjoy a well-earned meal. She stepped inside, immediately noticing the soft hum of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the gentle notes of a piano playing in the background. The restaurant was spacious, with neatly arranged tables covered in crisp white linens. A large chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting a golden glow over the room. Olivia smiled slightly. It was as beautiful as she had imagined. She approached the hostess stand where a man in a black suit stood. His name had read Richard. He had sharp features, neatly combed hair, and a stiff posture. Olivia gave him a polite smile. "Good evening," she said. "I'd like a table for one, please." Richard barely glanced at her before responding. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We are fully booked tonight." Olivia blinked, slightly taken aback. She looked around the restaurant. More than half the tables were empty. "Oh," she said, keeping her voice polite. "I didn't make a reservation, but it seems like you have some open tables." Richard's expression didn't change. "I'm afraid they're all reserved." Something about the way he said it made Olivia pause. There was no hesitation, no checking of the reservation list, just a quick dismissal. Before she could reply, the door opened behind her. A couple entered, an older man and woman dressed casually in jeans and jackets. Olivia stepped aside as Richard greeted them with a warm smile. "Good evening, sir," he said smoothly. "Right this way." Olivia turned slightly, watching as he led them toward a table near the window. No questions, no reservations, no hesitation. Her hands tightened slightly around the strap of her purse. She felt a familiar sting in her chest, a mix of disbelief, anger, and something deeper, something heavier. She had seen this happen before. She had fought against it in courtrooms, spoken about it at conferences, read about it in history books. And yet, standing here, in this moment, it felt different. It felt personal. She took a deep breath. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. Richard turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "You just gave them a table," she said, without checking a reservation list. Richard's polite smile remained frozen in place. "I apologize for the confusion, ma'am. But as I said, we are fully booked." Olivia studied him for a moment. His posture was stiff, his eyes cold, and there was something in his tone, a quiet finality, an unspoken message. She had two choices. She could argue, demand to speak to a manager, cause a scene, or she could walk away, leaving the moment behind like so many others had done before her. For a long moment, she didn't move. The sounds of the restaurant carried on around her, the clinking of forks, the low murmur of conversations, the distant laughter from a table near the bar. Then, slowly, she nodded. "All right," she said softly. She turned and walked out the door. The cold air hit her instantly, but she barely noticed. She stood still for a moment, her heart beating steadily in her chest. A part of her wanted to let it go, to shake off the feeling and move on. But another part of her, a stronger part, refused. She had won a case today. She had spent years fighting for justice, and she was not about to let this moment slip away without doing something about it. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "James," she said as soon as the line connected. "Olivia. Hey, congratulations on the case." She exhaled, her breath visible in the night air. "Thanks, but listen, I need you to meet me tomorrow at Golden Oaks." There was a pause on the other end. Then James spoke, his voice sharp with interest. "What happened?" Olivia's grip on her phone tightened. "I think I just found our next big story." The night felt colder than before as Olivia walked down the quiet street, her mind racing. The city was alive around her, cars rushing past, people laughing in the distance, street vendors calling out their last sales of the evening. But she hardly noticed any of it. She had faced challenges before. As a lawyer, she had fought in courtrooms where the odds were against her. She had stood in front of judges, arguing for those who had no voice. She had felt anger, frustration, and the heavy weight of injustice. But tonight was different. Tonight, it was not about a legal battle. It was personal. She thought about the way Richard had looked at her, the quick dismissal, the cold indifference. He had not hesitated for even a second before turning her away. And then, without a moment's pause, he had welcomed the couple behind her. It was something she had read about, something she had heard in stories. But tonight, she had experienced it firsthand. She took a deep breath, pulling her coat tighter around her. She was not the type to let things go. She had spent her entire career standing up for what was right, and she was not going to stop now. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number. The call rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Olivia." James Porter sounded cheerful. "I was just about to call you. Congratulations on the case." She closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to push aside the emotions boiling inside her. "Thanks, James, but I need your help with something else." There was a pause. James had known Olivia long enough to recognize that tone in her voice. It was the same tone she had when she was preparing for a big case, the same tone she had when she was about to fight for something important. "What happened?" he asked, his voice turning serious. Olivia took a slow breath. "I went to Golden Oaks tonight. Wanted to celebrate." James waited. He knew there was more. "They turned me away," Olivia continued. "Said they were fully booked. But they weren't." James didn't respond right away. He was a journalist. He had covered stories like this before. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Did they give you any reason?" She let out a small, bitter laugh. "Yeah. They said they had no tables. But the couple right behind me, white, dressed casually, walked right in. No reservation, no questions asked." Now James was quiet for a different reason. "I see," he said after a moment. "What do you want to do?" Olivia looked up at the sky, her breath visible in the cold air. "I'm going back tomorrow," she said. "But this time, I'm not going alone." James didn't hesitate. "I'll be there." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Bring a camera." After hanging up, she leaned against the brick wall of a nearby building. Her heart was still pounding. She knew what she was getting into. She knew that places like Golden Oaks had money, influence, and power. They could try to deny everything. But she had never been afraid of a fight. The next morning, Olivia woke up early, her mind still focused on her plan. She sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. The city outside her window was just beginning to wake up. She pulled out a notebook and started writing down names. People she knew, people who had power in their own way. Judges, lawyers, doctors, journalists. Black professionals who had faced the same silent barriers over and over again. People who understood. She made a dozen calls. Some were confused at first. Others were instantly on board. By the end of the morning, she had gathered a group of people who were willing to stand by her side. They would meet her at Golden Oaks that evening. By late afternoon, she got a message from James. "James, I have my camera team ready. We'll be outside waiting. Let's make sure the world sees this." Olivia smiled slightly. That was exactly what she wanted. When evening arrived, Olivia dressed carefully. She wore a sleek, dark blue suit, sharp, elegant, impossible to ignore. She wanted to make sure there was no excuse, no reason they could use against her. At precisely 7 p.m., she arrived at Golden Oaks again. This time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a line of well-dressed men and women. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, professors. Each one of them had experienced discrimination in some form. Each one of them understood why this moment mattered. Just outside the entrance, James and his team stood with their cameras ready. The moment Olivia stepped forward, they started filming. Inside the restaurant, Richard stood at the hostess stand again. The moment he saw Olivia, his expression changed. For a split second, he looked uncertain. Then he forced a polite smile. "Good evening, ma'am." Olivia returned his smile, though hers held an edge of something sharper. "Good evening," she said. "I assume you have a table for us tonight." Richard hesitated. He glanced at the group behind her. The restaurant was busy, but not full. There were empty tables, just like last night. Before he could answer, another voice interrupted. "What's going on here?" A tall man in a gray suit stepped forward from the back of the restaurant. His hair was neatly combed, his expression serious. He looked like someone who was used to being in charge. Olivia recognized him instantly. Henry Lawson, the owner of Golden Oaks. He had clearly been called in for this. Someone must have warned him. Olivia turned to face him directly. "I believe your staff owes me an explanation," she said. Lawson glanced at Richard, then back at Olivia. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked smoothly. Olivia raised an eyebrow. "The problem," she repeated. "Your restaurant turned me away last night, but they let others in, no questions asked." Lawson sighed. "I'm sure it was a misunderstanding." Olivia didn't move. Was it? Behind her, James's camera crew filmed everything. Other diners inside the restaurant had started to notice. Some whispered to each other, curious about what was happening. A few had even pulled out their phones, recording the exchange. Lawson's jaw tightened. He had a choice to make. He could try to deny it, or he could face the truth. After a long pause, he exhaled. "Miss Carter, I'd like to invite you and your guests to dine with us tonight. No charge." Olivia studied him. "That's very generous," she said. "But generosity isn't the same as accountability." A muscle twitched in Lawson's jaw. "What would you like me to do?" he asked carefully. Olivia tilted her head slightly. "I'd like to know how you plan to make sure this doesn't happen again." For the first time, Lawson looked truly uncomfortable. He glanced around at the cameras, the guests, the staff watching from the sidelines. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. And Olivia knew. He was starting to realize that this wasn't just about one night. This was about something much bigger, and she wasn't going anywhere. The evening air carried a quiet tension as Olivia Carter stepped out of the black car, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The city was alive around her. Lights flashing, cars passing, people moving in and out of restaurants and shops. But at this moment, all she could focus on was the glass doors of Golden Oaks standing just a few feet away. Tonight was different. Tonight, she was not walking in alone. Behind her, a group of well-dressed professionals followed her lead. Lawyers, doctors, business owners, professors, men and women who had worked hard, built their careers, and made names for themselves. People who, despite their success, had faced moments like the one Olivia had experienced just the night before. Moments where they were judged before they even spoke. James Porter and his camera crew stood at the entrance, already filming. He gave Olivia a small nod. Everything was in place. Inside the restaurant, Richard stood behind the hostess stand. His posture was rigid, his eyes darting from Olivia to the group behind her. The warm glow of the restaurant's chandelier reflected off the polished floors, and the scent of roasted herbs and wine filled the air. The atmosphere was just as luxurious as before, elegant, refined. But the energy in the room had shifted. Guests turned their heads, conversations lowering to whispers as they noticed Olivia and the group standing at the entrance. Some of them recognized her. Her name had been all over the news just yesterday for winning a major civil rights case. Others were simply curious. It wasn't every day that a crowd like this entered a restaurant together, with cameras following. Richard swallowed hard before forcing a polite smile. "Good evening, ma'am. Welcome to Golden Oaks." Olivia returned his smile, though hers was edged with something sharper. "Good evening," she said smoothly. "I trust you have a table for us tonight." For a split second, Richard hesitated. His eyes flickered toward the back of the restaurant, where Henry Lawson, the owner, stood watching. Olivia could see the uncertainty in his expression, the way his fingers tightened slightly on the reservation book. He was trapped. If he turned them away now, it would be caught on camera, seen by everyone. And if he let them in, it would be a silent admission that something had been wrong the night before. Lawson stepped forward before Richard could answer. His face was calm, but there was something in his eyes, something careful. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Welcome back." Olivia met his gaze. "It's nice to be back," she said, her voice just as controlled. "I assume there won't be a problem finding us a table this evening." Lawson exhaled softly. He had been expecting this, preparing for it ever since he had received the call earlier that day. The news had spread fast. Olivia Carter, a well-known lawyer, had been denied service at Golden Oaks, and now she had returned, with witnesses, with cameras, and with an undeniable presence. Lawson forced a small smile. "Of course. Right this way." The restaurant was silent as Olivia and her group followed him toward an elegantly set table near the center of the room. The soft sound of their footsteps was the only noise for a moment. Guests watched with careful curiosity. Some of them shifted in their seats, glancing at each other as if waiting for something to happen. A few of them picked up their phones, snapping quiet pictures or sending messages. James and his camera crew positioned themselves carefully, making sure to capture every moment. As Olivia took her seat, she noticed Richard stepping back toward the hostess stand, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at her directly, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. The waiters moved quickly, bringing out menus, pouring glasses of water. Their movements were smooth, rehearsed, trained in the art of fine dining service. But the energy in the room had changed. There was an awareness now, a sense that something important was happening, even if not everyone fully understood what it was yet. Olivia took her menu, scanning it briefly before looking up at Lawson. "I appreciate the hospitality," she said, her tone polite. Lawson nodded slightly. "We aim to provide the best service to all our guests." Olivia held his gaze. "Do you?" A flicker of something crossed his face, just for a second. But he recovered quickly. "That is always our goal," he said smoothly. James, sitting at a nearby table, leaned forward slightly. He wasn't speaking, but Olivia knew the cameras were capturing everything. The tension, the careful words, the way the restaurant staff seemed unsure of how to proceed. Olivia set her menu down. "You know," she said, her voice casual but firm, "I never had trouble getting a table at other fine dining restaurants in the city. But last night, I was turned away. No hesitation. No checking the reservation list. The table was silent. The entire restaurant was silent." Lawson's jaw tightened. "As I said before, Miss Carter, that was a misunderstanding." "Was it?" Olivia asked lightly. "Because I saw others walk in after me, and they were seated immediately." Lawson took a slow breath. "If there was an error in judgment, I assure you, it was not intentional." Olivia tilted her head slightly. "Not intentional," she repeated, letting the words hang in the air. The silence in the restaurant deepened. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Lawson glanced around, aware of how many eyes were on him. He knew he couldn't afford to say the wrong thing. Olivia let the moment stretch just a little longer before she finally leaned back in her chair. She picked up her menu again, flipping it open. "Well," she said, her tone light but purposeful, "I'm glad that's been cleared up. I'm looking forward to the meal." For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if on cue, the waiters rushed forward, taking orders, pouring drinks. The soft hum of conversation slowly returned, though it was still tinged with curiosity. James caught Olivia's eye from across the room and gave her the smallest nod. The message had been sent. They had walked in, taken their seats, and been served, not because the restaurant had suddenly changed overnight, but because they had forced it to acknowledge them. And now, everyone in the room knew it. Olivia took a sip of her water, her gaze steady as she looked around the restaurant. This was only the beginning. The soft clinking of glasses and the quiet murmur of conversation filled Golden Oaks, but the air was thick with tension. Olivia Carter could feel the weight of every glance, every whisper, the restaurant's usual elegance, the dim golden lights, the soft music playing in the background, the neatly folded napkins on fine china, felt like a thin veil over the unspoken battle happening in the room. She could see it in the way the waiters moved, quicker than usual, careful not to make eye contact. She could see it in the way some diners stole glances at her table, then quickly looked away when she met their gaze. And most of all, she could see it in Henry Lawson's face. The restaurant owner sat at the bar, pretending to sip his drink while his eyes flickered toward her table every few minutes. He was watching, waiting, measuring every second. Olivia knew that this was more than just a dinner now. This was a message. Her presence, along with the presence of the highly accomplished black professionals who sat with her, challenged the silent rules that had existed within places like Golden Oaks for years. And Henry Lawson hated it. She picked up her fork, calmly taking a bite of her food. It was good. It always had been. That was never the issue. The issue was the invisible doors that people like Lawson had built, doors that had been closed in her face just last night. And now she had walked right through them. James Porter, seated at a nearby table, had his phone resting against a water glass, its camera recording. His news instincts had told him from the start that this wasn't over. Olivia could feel it too. Something was coming, and she was ready for it. A few tables away, a couple stood up and left abruptly, leaving half-finished plates behind. Olivia noticed the way Lawson's jaw tightened at the sight. He was losing customers. That was what he had feared the most. Not the cameras, not the headlines. He feared losing the comfort of his regular guests. People who had enjoyed the unspoken exclusivity of Golden Oaks for years. People who had never had to think twice about whether they belonged there. Lawson set his glass down and stood. He took slow, measured steps toward Olivia's table, stopping just at the edge. His hands rested on the back of an empty chair, but he didn't sit. "Ms. Carter," he said smoothly, "I trust everything is to your satisfaction tonight." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "The food is excellent," she said. "As expected." Lawson nodded. "I'm glad to hear that." He paused. "And I assume there are no issues with the service this evening." The question was loaded. Olivia heard what he was really asking. "Are you done? Have you made your point?" She set her fork down, resting her hands lightly on the table. "The service is very attentive tonight." A flicker of something crossed Lawson's face, something close to irritation. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being challenged in his own restaurant. "I want you to know, Miss Carter," he said carefully, "that Golden Oaks has always prided itself on excellence. We serve all our guests with the highest standard of hospitality." A soft, knowing smile touched Olivia's lips. "All your guests." Lawson exhaled slowly. He knew he was being pulled into dangerous territory. "Last night was a mistake," he said finally. "And I regret that it happened." Regret, not an apology. Olivia let his words hang in the air. The restaurant was quieter now, more people watching, waiting to see what she would say next. She took her time. Then, with deliberate ease, She leaned forward slightly. "A mistake is when you bring the wrong order to a table," she said. "A mistake is when you forget to refill a guest's water glass." She held his gaze. What happened last night was a decision. The silence in the restaurant grew heavier. Lawson's fingers tightened around the back of the chair. "Miss Carter, you decided," Olivia continued smoothly, "that my presence in this restaurant was a problem, and you acted accordingly." She watched the way his throat moved as he swallowed. His carefully crafted mask of control was cracking. She could hear the sound of James's phone camera clicking softly. This moment, this exact moment, was what they had come for. Lawson shifted slightly, his weight moving from one foot to the other. "As I said," he said, his voice tight, "I regret that it happened." Olivia nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "Then let's make sure it doesn't happen again." Lawson's brows pulled together slightly. "I can assure you, it won't." Olivia tilted her head slightly. "I'd like to hear how you plan to make that happen." Lawson hesitated. For the first time that evening, he looked truly unsure of himself. "We don't tolerate discrimination at Golden Oaks," he said finally. "Our staff is trained to provide equal service to all guests." Olivia didn't look away. "Then why wasn't I served?" Lawson opened his mouth, then closed it. Because in truth, he had no real answer. Because in truth, Olivia had already won. The restaurant was watching. The cameras were recording. The weight of the moment was crushing down on him. And for the first time, Henry Lawson, the owner of Golden Oaks, a place that had quietly built its reputation on exclusion, was the one who didn't belong. Olivia gave him one last look before picking up her fork again. "Thank you for checking in, Mr. Lawson," she said smoothly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we'd like to enjoy our meal." A muscle twitched in Lawson's jaw, but he had no choice. He nodded stiffly. "Of course." And then, with nothing left to say, he turned and walked away. As soon as he disappeared, Olivia heard a soft chuckle from James's table. She glanced in his direction, and he gave her a small, approving nod. She turned back to her plate, her appetite suddenly returning. Tonight, she had made her point. But this wasn't over. Not yet. The night was supposed to end quietly. Olivia Carter had made her point, had forced Henry Lawson to acknowledge her, and had ensured that Golden Oaks would think twice before denying service to someone like her again. But as she sat at her table, slowly finishing her meal, she could feel it. Something was shifting. It wasn't just about one dinner anymore. The restaurant's atmosphere had changed, and not just because of her presence. There was a ripple effect happening, something bigger than just this moment. Conversations were softer, glances lingered longer, and the staff moved with a nervous energy, as if waiting for something else to unfold. Then it happened. A man at the far end of the restaurant stood up. He was middle-aged, wearing an expensive gray suit, the kind of man who looked like he had been dining at Golden Oaks for years. His voice cut through the soft hum of conversation. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, tossing his napkin onto the table. His wife, a well-dressed woman with pearl earrings, touched his arm, but he pulled away. "She's making a scene," he continued, his voice louder now. He wasn't looking directly at Olivia, but everyone knew who he was talking about. Olivia set her fork down, her expression calm but focused. She had expected this. Another guest, an older man seated nearby, cleared his throat. "She's just having dinner, Robert." Robert scoffed. "This isn't just dinner, it's a performance." He turned slightly toward Olivia's table. "And frankly, it's ruining the experience for the rest of us." A few people shifted uncomfortably, unsure of whether to agree or remain silent. Others just watched, waiting. Olivia met his gaze, her voice even when she spoke. "If my presence here ruins your experience, maybe the problem isn't me." Robert let out a short, bitter laugh. "Oh, please, we all know what this is. You didn't come here for the food. You came here to prove a point." Olivia leaned back in her chair. "I did," she said, not denying it. "And I think I proved it pretty well." The restaurant was holding its breath now. Robert's wife touched his arm again. "Sit down," she whispered, clearly uncomfortable. But Robert wasn't finished. He turned to Henry Lawson, who had been standing near the bar, watching everything unfold with clenched fists. "Are you really going to let her turn Golden Oaks into some kind of spectacle?" Robert demanded. "This place used to have standards." Lawson hesitated. Olivia could see the war inside him. His instinct to side with the man who had probably been a loyal customer for years, and his understanding that one wrong word could make things even worse. Then, for the first time that evening, Lawson did something unexpected. He took a deep breath and spoke. "Robert," he said, his voice carefully measured, "Miss Carter is a guest here, just like you." Robert blinked, as if he had misheard. "She wasn't a guest last night," he snapped. Lawson exhaled slowly. That was a mistake. Olivia tilted her head slightly. He had said those words before, but this time, there was something different in his voice. Robert stared at him for a long moment, then let out another scoff. "Unbelievable." He grabbed his coat, shaking his head as he turned to leave. "This place isn't what it used to be." His wife hesitated for a second before following him. The door swung shut behind them, the sound ringing through the now silent restaurant. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, a woman at the back of the restaurant clapped. It was just one person at first, a slow, deliberate clap. Then another. Then a few more. And suddenly, the quiet tension in the air shifted into something else. Olivia didn't smile, but she met Lawson's gaze. He looked exhausted, like a man who had just realized he had been fighting a battle he didn't even know he had been part of. He turned, walking back toward the bar, not saying another word. James Porter leaned slightly toward Olivia's table. "That," he murmured, "was interesting." Olivia picked up her glass of water, taking a slow sip before setting it down again. "It was bound to happen." James nodded. "What do you think?" She glanced around the restaurant. Some guests were still cautious, unsure of where they stood in all of this. But others, people who had been quiet before, were now watching her with something different in their eyes. Something close to respect. "I think," she said slowly, "that we're not done yet." The night had started with a quiet defiance, but now it had turned into something much larger. Olivia Carter sat at the table, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. Around her, the energy of the restaurant had shifted. The tension was still there, but now it carried a different weight, one that was no longer just about her. She could feel the stares of the guests, hear the hushed conversations, sense the way people were processing what had just happened. The man in the gray suit had left, but his words still hung in the air, unspoken but not forgotten. Olivia had seen moments like this before. Moments where people were forced to confront the things they had ignored for too long. Moments where silence was no longer an option. Across the room, James Porter leaned back in his chair, his sharp journalist's eyes scanning the room. He had been covering stories like this for years, but even he knew that something about tonight was different. "This isn't just about Golden Oaks anymore," he murmured. Olivia met his gaze. "It never was." He nodded, as if he had been expecting that answer. At the bar, Henry Lawson remained still, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on unstable ground. A man who had built something carefully over the years, only to see the cracks forming beneath his feet. For years, Golden Oaks had been more than just a restaurant. It had been a symbol of quiet exclusivity. The kind of place where only a certain type of guest felt welcome, where the rules were never written down but always understood. And tonight, those unspoken rules had been broken. Olivia took a slow sip of her drink, her mind already moving beyond this room, beyond this night. Because this wasn't just about her. She thought about the young black professionals who had walked into places like this, only to be met with polite excuses. She thought about the families who had been made to feel like outsiders in spaces that should have been open to all. This was bigger than one dinner, bigger than one confrontation. This was about the message it sent, and whether Lawson wanted to admit it or not, the message had already been delivered. A soft voice broke through her thoughts. "Miss Carter." Olivia looked up to see a young server standing beside her table, her hands clasped together tightly. She couldn't have been more than 22, her nervous energy clear in the way she shifted slightly from foot to foot. I just wanted to say." The server hesitated, glancing quickly toward the bar where Lawson still stood. Then she took a small breath and straightened her shoulders. "I just wanted to say thank you." Olivia studied her, waiting. The girl swallowed. "I started working here 6 months ago," she said, "and I've noticed." She trailed off, as if unsure of how much she was allowed to say. But Olivia understood. "You don't have to explain," Olivia said gently. The girl gave a small nod, relief flickering across her face. "I just wanted you to know that some of us see it, and we know it's wrong." Olivia offered her a small, reassuring smile. "That means a lot." The girl hesitated for another second, then quickly turned and walked away before anyone could call attention to her. James raised an eyebrow. "Looks like you have supporters in unexpected places." Olivia glanced back at the bar, where Lawson had finally turned away, pretending to focus on the bottle of whiskey in front of him. "There are always supporters," Olivia said. "They just need to know it's safe to speak." James let out a quiet breath. "You think tonight changed anything?" She picked up her fork, cutting into the last bite of her meal. "I think tonight made sure people can't pretend anymore." James nodded slowly. "That's a start." And Olivia knew he was right. This was just the beginning. The night at Golden Oaks had ended, but the impact of what had happened did not fade. Olivia Carter walked out of the restaurant with her head held high, stepping into the cool night air. The city lights flickered above, casting a soft glow over the quiet streets. The moment felt bigger than her, bigger than just one meal, one confrontation. She had walked into Golden Oaks to prove a point, but she was leaving with something more. James Porter walked beside her, his phone tucked away in his pocket now, though she knew the story he had captured would soon reach far beyond these streets. He had been in this business long enough to recognize when something had the power to spark change. "You think Lawson learned anything tonight?" James asked, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp with curiosity. Olivia let out a quiet breath. "I think Lawson learned that his way of doing things is no longer unchallenged." James nodded, hands in his pockets. "That's something, at least." She looked up at the restaurant one last time, watching as a few late-night diners still lingered inside, their conversations hushed. Some of them would forget about this night, moving on with their lives as if nothing had happened. But others, people like the young server who had thanked her, would remember. And that was what mattered. Because change didn't always happen in a single moment. It happened in the quiet thoughts people carried home with them. It happened in the questions they started to ask, in the things they could no longer ignore. And Olivia knew that the seeds of change had been planted tonight. She had no doubt that some people would be angry. There would be those who saw her as a troublemaker, who whispered about how she had ruined their beloved restaurant. But there would also be others, people who had never questioned the way things were, who would start to see the truth. She had seen it in the faces of some of the diners as she left. A shift, a realization. James let out a soft chuckle. "You know, there was a time when something like this would have stayed behind closed doors. No one would have heard about it." Olivia smiled slightly. "Not anymore." They had walked a few blocks now, the sounds of the restaurant fading behind them. James glanced at her. "So, what's next?" Olivia looked ahead, the city stretching before her. There was always another fight, another door that needed to be opened. But for now, she allowed herself to take in the moment. "I think," she said finally, "that tonight was just the beginning." James nodded, as if he had expected that answer. And as Olivia walked forward, she knew that the ripples of what had happened tonight would spread. Maybe not immediately, maybe not loudly, but they would spread. And that was how change began.